Welcome to Al Jazeera.
It's November the 15th, day one of a new era in television news.
I'm Shuli Ghosh.
And I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Al Jazeera.
Welcome to the world news from Al Jazeera and the very first programme live from our Doha news headquarters here in the heart of the Middle East.
In the next hour, we'll be going live to the world's top news stories.
I'm Noor Odeh in the Gaza Strip, which has been brought to the brink of chaos and despair by sanctions, siege and shelling.
I'm Haru Mitasa in Darfur, scene of the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
I'm Raghi Omar in Tehran. Could Iran's president really hold the key to peace in the Middle East?
I'm Farai Sevenzo in Zimbabwe, where every day can be a battle for survival.
On Al Jazeera, we'll be setting the news agenda. In this hour, we'll also be reporting from Brazil on an indigenous community with one of the highest suicide rates in the world. The Democratic Republic of Congo, where a disputed election could still lead back to civil war. And from Somalia, Africa's most dangerous city is peaceful for now, but for how long?
We'll also go to Russia as George Bush starts his first foreign visit since defeat in the midterm elections. To Jerusalem for reaction to a fatal rocket attack on an Israeli town. On to Afghanistan, billions spent on rebuilding, but where's the money gone? And to China for a joyride with the boy racers of Beijing.
Also coming up, an exclusive report from Iraq on the daily battles to bury the victims of sectarian conflict. And as we go to where we have some breaking news, a tsunami is heading towards the north of Japan. It's expected to hit within the next 5 minutes. Japan's meteorological agency has told all people living along the Pacific coast in the north of the country to flee to higher ground.
And at the moment, the tsunami is predicted to be pushing waves of 2 meters. The tsunami has been caused by an earthquake measuring at least 8.1 on the Richter scale, centered near the Kuril Islands, that's to the northeast.
And we'll bring you more on that a little later.
First, a new era in international news begins with the launch of this channel.
Yes, building on the heritage of Al Jazeera's fearless journalism, we aim to bring a fresh perspective to world news coverage. Mike Hanna reports.
A new point of view, an international news channel with a truly global perspective, the first ever to be broadcast from the Middle East in English.
The amount of intolerance and the amount of troubles and conflicts that we see right now, I think major part of reason of it is the fact that people cannot understand each other. Therefore, Al Jazeera will bridge that divide and will try to introduce nations and cultures and civilizations to each other.
It's now 10 years since Al Jazeera was launched, introducing the concept of an independent news source in an area where one had never been. Striving to present all points of view, it has on many occasions been caught in the middle.
وأنا ألوم الجزيرة مرة أخرى إنها تسوق للأمريكان قبل أن تتأكد.
I can definitively say that what Al Jazeera is doing is vicious, inaccurate, and inexcusable.
Outside the Al Jazeera offices in Doha, a memorial to journalists around the world who've lost their lives. In April 2003, reporter Tariq Ayoub was killed by US forces while reporting from the Al Jazeera bureau in Baghdad. Correspondent Taysir Alouni spent years in prison and is still under house arrest in Spain. Cameraman Sami Al-Hajj has been held in detention without trial in Guantanamo for the past 4 years. Correspondents around the globe have been beaten and threatened.
I'm media, guys. I'm media. Isn't that enough? Media.
The Al Jazeera offices in Kabul and Baghdad have been bombed, but the coverage continued. It's a proud tradition that Al Jazeera English will follow. Here in Doha and at news centres in London, Washington and Kuala Lumpur, people from more than 40 nations have come together with one common intent: to set the news agenda, to provide information that is honest and accurate. Al Jazeera brought to the world a new vision that will now be carried forward. It's a vision rooted in a sense of democracy and in the idea that everyone has the right to know. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera.
It's the issue that dominates politics in the Middle East and beyond. The conflict between Israel and Palestine. Wednesday brought yet another casualty. An elderly woman killed in a Palestinian rocket attack in the Israeli town of Sderot near the Gaza border. An Israeli minister is now warning so-called terror organizations will pay a heavy price. It's the first fatal attack on Israel from Gaza for more than 6 months, although hundreds of rockets have been fired. That one fatality, of course, is in sharp contrast to the more than 350 Palestinian deaths since Israeli troops began their Gaza offensive in June. It's now 1 week since these images from Bet Hanun shocked the world. But of course, the deaths caused by the Israeli military aren't the only cause of Palestinian suffering. Since Hamas won the elections back in January, Israeli and international sanctions have meant vital aid hasn't made it through to the people most in need. Al Jazeera's David Chater looks at the reality of life under sanctions, siege and shelling.
The agony of Gaza etched on the faces of its children. Their hold on life now as fragile as the hopes for peace. But Israeli artillery shells are not the only danger stalking the future of a new generation of Palestinians here. In the ruins of a disintegrating economy, it's being called the hidden hunger. The UN's World Food Programme say 85% of Gazans are now dependent on food handouts. In the rubble of their home left by the Israeli army when they ended their occupation of Bet Hanun, these children are not looking for their favorite toys or clothes. It's food that's now their most valuable possession, a carton of olive oil and a sack of flour. After days of humiliation and hunger, their mother weeps in anger and grief. But beneath the surface here, tens of thousands of families are now living a life of quiet desperation, unable to provide their children with the food they need.
1.1 million people in the Gaza Strip are dependent on UN food handouts to survive.
The first cases of malnutrition are beginning to appear in the clinics. Besma is just 6 months old. Her name in English means smile. She's desperately underweight for her age. The lifeline of economic aid to Gaza has been cut since Hamas was elected. In some places, 9 out of every 10 men are now unemployed. Dr. Hamad, a Palestinian academic, visiting his parents in their partially destroyed home in the town, told me the Israelis might have redeployed their troops, but they were continuing their occupation, politically, socially, and economically.
They control the Palestinian, putting them in a big cage, and this cage, a human being between two, looking at them. We are controlling you, we are the main player, we know the time and the place and how we deal with you, and that's the disaster that Palestinians they have to recognize in this moment.
Besieged on all sides, the Palestinians in Gaza see little hope of their ordeal ending. The rockets will continue to be fired into Israel, and Israeli shells will continue to land in their fields and their homes. David Chater, Al Jazeera, Bet Hanun.
Well, we've got correspondents throughout the Palestinian territories and in Israel, so let's talk to two of them now. Jackie Rowland in Jerusalem and Noor O'Day in Gaza. Let's come to you first, Jackie. Israel obviously justifies its siege because Palestinian militants continue to fire rockets. We've seen the latest attack in Sderot. What more can you tell us about that rocket strike?
Well, I think, Shuli, what was so significant for Israelis was that this time there were actually fatalities. One woman was killed and another man was injured. Now, Israeli public opinion, you're obviously aware of what's happening in Gaza, but I have to say that people here really do empathise very strongly with Israelis living in the south under constant terror with these Qassam rockets launching virtually every day. And so really I'd say that Israeli public opinion is quite hard against the situation in Gaza and against the Palestinian armed groups that are firing these rockets into Israel.
Now, what has been the Israelis' response? Because an Israeli minister has called for widening the military operation in Gaza as a result. And of course, the Israelis are saying that they will stop these attacks at all costs.
The Israeli military doctrine really is to attack at any stage where they feel that Israel is under threat, and certainly that would fall into this kind of category. I mean, at the moment, the government strategy seems to be a little in contradiction with itself. There are some ministers who think it's sufficient to try and have pinpoint operations, although, as we saw last week in Beit Hanun, those pinpoint operations aren't always so accurate. However, there is another part of opinion within the government that Israel should go for an all-out military offensive against Gaza, and certainly following the rocket attack in Sderot today, ministers are saying that there will be a very sharp response indeed.
OK, well, let's cross to Noor in Gaza now. Noor, the Fatah and Hamas are currently discussing a unity government, which may have the possibility of easing sanctions, which is causing such suffering amongst the Palestinians. How are those talks going?
Well, they're still going, and there's a lot of optimism in the air about these talks. Fatah and Hamas officials are voicing their optimism that these talks may, in fact, at the end yield a national unity government acceptable to both and hopefully acceptable to the international community as well. Fatah officials also tell us and the rest of the media that they are seeking Arab support to begin breaking the siege imposed on the Palestinian Authority since the rise of Hamas. So they're hoping that this agreement will bring in an end to the financial sanctions which have really caused a serious humanitarian crisis here in Gaza.
But of course, the key question is whether this new government will recognise Israel, because that is one of the conditions to getting the sanctions lifted.
That's correct. I mean, I'm standing here in Beit Hanun, the scene of Israel's last wide-scale military operation, where 82 civilians were killed. This is declared as a disaster zone. Residents here are looking towards the creation of a national unity government that would lift the sanctions imposed on them, that would ease the restrictions and allow them to receive more assistance and to have job opportunities. That all hinges upon the acceptance of the quartet, namely the United States and the European Union, of the upcoming government's political program. And that's really the key here. What will the next government have as its political program? Will it be able to convince the West that it can talk to the West, that it can speak to Israel, that it can be a member of the international community that they can deal with and assist in bringing this crisis to an end?
OK, thank you to both of you for those updates. Noor Day in Gaza and Jackie Rowland in Jerusalem. Well, staying with Gaza, in an exclusive interview for Al Jazeera, Khaled Mishal, the head of Hamas's political bureau, is claiming Israel turned down a deal offered by Hamas aimed at sparing civilian lives.
We presented an initiative in which we proposed to remove civilians on both sides from the equation. We said, if Israel stops killing our women, children and civilians, we will halt any operation which may lead to the killing of Israeli women, children and civilians. Israel rejected this initiative.
Well, more on that and an interview with Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Shimon Peres in our news hour at 1500 GMT. Later in this programme, we'll hear the story of Khaled Abu Sada, an ambulance driver on the front line in Gaza.
Well, it's one of the worst and least understood humanitarian crises in the world today, and millions of people are caught up in it. Darfur, Sudan. The government in Khartoum denies accusations that it's using militias to drive local tribes out of the region, but it's clear that the suffering in Darfur is immense. The figures are disputed by the Sudanese government, but according to the United Nations, on average, 360 people die every day, killed in the violence or victims of starvation and preventable disease. Well, over the past 3 years, an estimated 400,000 people have lost their lives. And at least 2 million refugees have been driven from their homes. Well, many of them have ended up in huge, sprawling refugee camps, but conflict has even followed them there. In a moment, we'll take you live to the As-Salam, or peace camp in Darfur, where Al Jazeera's Haru Mutasa is waiting to give us the latest. But first, this from Andrew Simmons.
Politics in Darfur comes with heavy protection. The man under guard here cuts a lonely figure under immense pressure. 6 months ago, Mini Manawi signed up his Sudan liberation movement to a peace process. He was the only rebel leader to do so. His movement entered the corridors of a power they were once fighting, and Mini Manawi took a place in the Sudanese government. But in the sprawling camps of Darfur, Manawi's support base is suffering. His people had hoped the violence would end, and they returned to their homes with compensation for their losses. This camp is called El Salam, the peace, but really that's the wrong way to describe it. Places of refuge like this serve as a cauldron for resentment, extreme hardship and division. Over there, the majority tribe is Zagawa. They're in favor of the peace agreement. While over here, the tribe is called the Four. They're dead against the agreement. They're called the non-signatories. So this camp is quite literally split down the middle. This family is on the side that supported the peace deal. They say they're no longer hopeful that their insecurity and destitution will end. Mahmoud Alias told me he used to be a farmer with a herd of cattle. Now his family live here with a monthly ration of 13 kilos of grain. He traveled to address Mini Manawi directly. He wasn't alone. Manawi followers doubting their leader. Women fearful of life in the camps. In private, these widows complained about their insecurity. Did he think a UN protection force would make a difference?
For 3 years, they are talking to the United Nations. Where's the United Nations now? It is depend on United Nations itself. It is not my own problem. But I do my effort to stabilize the situation.
Does it feel stressful for you right now? Your position right now, it must feel quite stressful meeting your people and finding this level of pressure upon you.
Because that's my people. Whatever the pressure, it is my own pressure. It is not problem. I cannot avoid these pressures until I stabilize and solve the problems. Thank you very much.
But who can solve the problems? The African Union force is, by its own admission, inadequate. Arab militias and rebel factions need to be disarmed. Protection is required for the people. The lives of millions depend upon it. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, El Fashir in Darfur.
Well, let's go now live to Haru Mutasa at As-Salam camp. What exactly are conditions like there, Haru?
Well, Sammy, it looks desperate. People live in basic structures. They're made from sticks and held together by bits of string. Now, it gets very, very hot here, as high as 45 degrees. And at night, the temperature drops. It's very, very cold. As many as 9 people sleep in there, and sometimes they're only sharing one blanket. Now, this camp is less than a year old, and already there are 40,000 people living in here. This is where they get their water. It's switched on at specific times of the day, and the women use these jerry cans to fill them up. If you look over there, that water tank, which was put up by an aid organization, is what's making it possible for them to get this water. The honest fact is that they feel that if aid workers weren't in the camp, they would not have any water at all.
Haru, what are people telling you in terms of the international community's role in all of this?
Well, Sammy, people aren't happy. I mean, the women I spoke to a short while ago were telling me that they still need more food, they need more water, they need blankets to look after their children. For now, they're trying to lead a normal life as they can. If you look over this way, this is the local market. The women spend the whole day sitting under here. They sell anything from peanuts to to okra, to other vegetables. They make less than $50 a day. It's not much, but it's enough to look after their families. For now, this is all that they will have to do until they feel it's safe enough for them to finally return home.
Haru Mutasa, our reporter, live in Darfur. Well, still ahead here, reports from Somalia and the Congo, plus surviving in Harare. We go live to Zimbabwe's capital for an exclusive insight into a country on the brink.
Well, let's go back now to our breaking news story. Japan's meteorological agency has told all people living along the Pacific coast in the north of the country to flee to higher ground after issuing a tsunami warning. Well, these are the pictures from Japanese television. We're looking at Hokkaido Island, one of the areas where the tsunami is predicted to hit in the next 2 to 3 minutes. It's been caused by an earthquake measuring at least 8.1 on the Richter scale. Now, the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004, which caused such devastation, was caused by one measuring 8.9. Let's cross now to our Kuala Lumpur News Centre and Dan Nolan for more. Dan, do you have any more details to give us?
No, we're still waiting to see whether this tsunami does hit Japan's northern coast. At the moment, it's due to hit there any moment. We don't have definite confirmation that a tsunami was generated as a result of the earthquake, but when it's that big, 8.1 is a really big earthquake, and a tsunami is probably expected to hit. They're saying the size of the waves should be 2 metres, which would be a lot smaller than the waves in the Aceh tsunami, which devastated Indonesia. At this stage, they're also saying that the last time this area has actually received earthquakes of this size was in 1994. That also generated a tsunami which claimed 11 lives. The reason the death toll was so low from such a big quake was the fact that it's a very low population in that area. So it's really just a wait and see at the moment and hoping for the best.
OK, Dan, we will, of course, be following that. Thank you for that update, Dan Nolan, there in our Kuala Lumpur Centre.
Well, it's headline news in the Western world. The British Prime Minister's comments on Iran during his annual foreign policy speech. Tony Blair told Iran that it should play a constructive role in the Middle East or face isolation. So how are Iranians reacting to Blair's comments? Al Jazeera's Raghi Omar is in Tehran. Raghi.
Sami, hello. Well, there's been quite a muted reaction to Tony Blair's comments here in the Iranian capital. And in some quarters, it's actually been quite a level of disinterest. The Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has been making a national speech televised here in Iran in the Kurdish areas where he barely mentioned it at all. But that doesn't mean that people aren't aware of what Tony Blair has been saying. And in fact, the noises coming out of James Baker's commission report into the policy of policy in Iraq in the United States. But I've been out in the streets in the Iranian capital to try to see what ordinary Iranians make of this comments by Tony Blair.
Western officials may be debating Tony Blair's comments about how Iran could resolve the crisis in Iraq, but it's been given little prominence here in Tehran. Even amongst the dozens of official and independent Iranian newspapers today, only one carried the story on its front page. Senior officials have also been muted in their response. At his press briefing yesterday, President Ahmadinejad didn't mention it, only saying that he would address the American people soon. There is a sense amongst people here that they've heard this all before, and previous attempts to begin contacts between Iranian and American diplomats in Baghdad came to nothing.
Whilst there has been hardly any comment in newspapers here on the diplomatic role that Iran could play in Iraq, the same is not true of ordinary Iranians. But their views are marked by suspicion of the United States and of Britain.
Many resent the fact that Britain and America did nothing to help Iran when it needed it.
If you want my personal opinion, we should not help them, because we were fighting Iraq for 8 years and no one came to help us, and instead Britain was helping Iraq.
My government must help and finish this story, because Iraq is a neighbor Iran and they're very important for Iran.
But many Iranians believe that Tony Blair's position is completely unrealistic. The view from Tehran is that Britain and the United States are in no position to set any preconditions to talks.
You cannot seek Iranian cooperation in Iraq
okay? And at the same time, freeze Iranian asset, force other countries, Japan, etc., not to invest in Iran, carry on with the sanction, carry on with lecturing Iran, carry on with bullying Iran, carrying, as United States does, spending money and to overthrow the Islamic regime.
The biggest and most immediate obstacle is the key demand that the Islamic Republic stop its nuclear enrichment program, something every Iranian leader has repeatedly said would never happen. And just before we came on air, Sammy, we got in touch with the British Embassy here in Tehran to ask if there had been any contact from the Iranian government, and they said that there hadn't as yet been any contact from officials in the presidency's office or anywhere else. Over to you.
Raghi Omar there live from Tehran. Thanks for that.
He's been in power for 26 years, but critics say the policies of Robert Mugabe are now destroying Zimbabwe and the lives of tens of thousands. The government blames drought and sanctions imposed by what it calls hostile former colonial powers. Whatever the cause, these statistics are frightening. The average Zimbabwean dies by the age of 37. 4 out of 5, 80% of Zimbabweans are out of work, and inflation is now running at around 1,200%. Let's cross live to the capital, Harare now, and Al Jazeera's correspondent Farai Sebenzo. Farai.
Thank you very much. Yes, you join us here. We are at the corner of Robert Mugabe Road and 1st Street in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. Understandably, we are the first international broadcaster to be broadcasting live from this capital in some 7 years, and we've gathered quite a crowd. But for the last 3 months, we've been watching how ordinary people are dealing with 1,200% inflation. Basic commodities like cooking oil and sugar are very expensive for ordinary people, and even fuel is hard to find.
These long petrol queues have become a symbol of Zimbabwe's economic meltdown. The economy is the worry of the age. How long have you been waiting in this petrol queue?
We spent almost a week.
A week?
Yes.
7 days?
7 days.
Waiting for petrol?
Waiting for petrol. Sometimes it comes once, sometimes no petrol, and we are having a big problem of fuel. We have our cars here, they are no longer moving. They're just parking and they are starving.
And after waiting all that time for petrol, there's no guarantee that they'll get any. The official exchange rate is 250 Zimbabwean dollars to $1 US. The black market does not agree. I go there to buy petrol. Here, $1 US buys almost 2,000 Zimbabwean dollars. Zimbabwe is an inflation country. But against all expectations, some things are still working. This runaway inflation, currently at 1,200%, has been caused by a drop in the country's agricultural production. In the meantime, the government is in a standoff with the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. At the Harare Magistrates' Courts, the unionists were on trial for demonstrating without permission. They had been severely beaten by the Zimbabwean police.
What's the extent of your injuries?
Suffered a broken arm, a broken ankle. Yes, and generally, the whole body suffered quite some beatings.
Workers can no longer afford transport. They have no access to antiretroviral drugs. In the end, Moses Ngondo's broken limbs were carried to a waiting car. The economy here badly needs a lift too.
Farai, these statistics we've heard are absolutely appalling. How on earth are people coping?
People are trying to survive by any means they can. This has become a city of dealers. Everybody is trying to buy cooking oil from South Africa. They're trying to buy anything and to sell it on and to make money. Above all, you must remember that a quarter of this country's population is reputed to be living abroad. So Zimbabwe is surviving basically by the remittances these family members are sending to their families here in Harare.
And what's the government saying? Because Robert Mugabe is steadfastly refusing to accept any blame for any of this.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the government's line is that Zimbabwe is in the crisis it's in because of hostile Western countries, in particular Britain. Zimbabwe says Britain has refused to pay for the land reform which they initiated in 2000. The whole story is that without these economic sanctions that the government says the West has placed on Zimbabwe, the country would be thriving.
Are these conditions leading to any political impact? Is there opposition growing to Mr. Mugabe?
The thing with the opposition is that it's been split and divided for the last 2 years. Morgan Tsvangirai leads one camp and Arthur Mutambara the other. There are several pressure groups, several human rights organizations that look after the very issue of human rights. The National Constituent Assembly, for example, has been campaigning for a new constitution that takes away the power from the executive presidency. That's the kind of opposition you see. And at the same time, there's a great deal of opposition press. But in terms of a real opposition that can mount as a meaningful challenge to the current power, there is none that we can see at the moment.
OK, Fari, thank you very much for that. Fari Savenzo in Harare there.
In Iraq, some of the dozens of education employees abducted at gunpoint on Tuesday have now been freed. Conflicting reports out of Baghdad put the number of those released at up to 40, with around 20 still being held. Well, Prime Minister Nour al-Maliki visited Baghdad University to reassure staff and students that the perpetrators would be punished. Under tight security, Maliki toured the campus and told academics that universities would stay open despite calls for a shutdown. He sought to play down Tuesday's mass kidnapping, describing the incident as a dispute between militias. Well, the violence shows no sign of abating. At least 14 people are dead and dozens wounded after 2 car bomb explosions in the capital. This blast took place at a petrol station near Iraq's Interior Ministry. The ministry's often been accused of being infiltrated by militias and is a frequent target of attacks. Iraq's civilian death toll keeps on rising, with sectarian conflict worsening. Nobody knows how many have died. The US military has never published figures on civilian deaths. They say it's an issue for the Iraqi government. But last December, George Bush said around 30,000 seemed an accurate estimate for civilian deaths since 2003. Well, last week, however, Iraq's health ministry said hospitals had reported up to 150,000 Iraqis killed by violent means. That's 2 or 3 times any previous official estimate. And a recent study by researchers using polling techniques concluded that more than 600,000 civilian deaths was probably a little more realistic. Well, one reason for the confusion over figures is the high number of unidentified bodies being found across Iraq. Huda Abdul Hamid has this report.
Mass graves in Iraq, an image of the past, very much in the present. These are the dead of Baghdad, victims of sectarian violence, their names unknown. Hundreds of bodies go unclaimed because in Baghdad it can be deadly for relatives to go to the morgue. So a group of volunteers takes care of the abandoned dead.
These dead do not have ID. We do not know who they are, whether they are Sunni, Shiites, Christians or Kurds. We just take the bodies from the morgues. Whoever they are, it's a duty.
Twice a week, refrigerated trucks travel south through the so-called Triangle of Death to the edge of the desert. Today, there are about 100 bodies, all killed more than 2 weeks ago, found dumped around the streets of Baghdad, most showing signs of torture. The bodies are lined up, wrapped in white cloth according to Islamic tradition. Sunni and Shiite alike, at odds in life, they're united in death. Each one gets a number, a new identity for an unknown victim. It matches a picture on file at the morgue, the only trace left for families to find them.
Each time I hope it will be the last load. I pray to God to bring peace.
But each day brings yet more dead. Before the end of the week, the volunteers will be back here to bury more nameless victims. Huda Abdul Hamid, Al Jazeera.
Back to our breaking news. A tsunami warning has been upgraded in Japan after an earthquake measuring at least 8.1 on the Richter scale occurred at sea. These are the latest pictures you're looking at. The quake was felt at 8:30 local time, and there are concerns that a tsunami is heading towards the northeastern coast of Japan. Authorities are evacuating 6 cities in the area. Meteorologists say a tsunami's waves after that magnitude earthquake could reach a high of up to 2 meters. And in other news, an elderly woman has been killed in a Palestinian rocket attack on the Israeli town of Sderot near the Gaza border. Israel is warning so-called terror organizations they will pay a heavy price.
Iran will be high on the agenda when US President George Bush meets his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in the next few hours. President Bush is dropping in as his aircraft refuels en route to Singapore. The two leaders will also address Russia's ambitions to join the World Trade Organization. Well, let's go over to Al Jazeera's correspondents Jonah Hull in Moscow and Rob Reynolds in Washington. Jonah, the Iran nuclear file is no doubt going to come up in talks between Bush and Putin later today.
We're told, of course, that Iran will be a subject of conversation, as too will be an important bilateral trade deal between the two sides, paving the way for Russia to enter the final stages of membership of the WTO. However, as this meeting, in fact, underway now, shortly enters its final stages, no one here is expecting any major breakthrough or announcements here on the ground in Moscow. I think for anything like that, look instead towards the weekend when these two men will meet again in bilateral talks on the edges of the APEC summit in Hanoi.
Jonah, how are trade relations between the United States and Russia playing out on the other issue of Russia's position towards Iran's nuclear ambitions?
Well, they could turn out to be crucially linked. In fact, there is talk that a deal has been reached in principle between Russian and American trade negotiators in terms of this WTO accession. If indeed such a deal has been reached, and if indeed ink is put to paper on that deal in Hanoi as planned, the current thinking is that Washington will have attempted to extract some sort of concessions or compromises from Russia in terms of its stand, particularly on sanctions against Iran. Certainly, I think that's what George Bush will be hoping for this weekend.
All right, good insight there, Jonah Hull in Moscow. Let's move over to Washington, D.C. Rob Reynolds, this is President Bush's first trip abroad since his electoral defeat. Does he still have the same stature as he used to?
Well, Sami, his stature has certainly been very greatly diminished, both domestically and internationally, by that electoral defeat, the resounding defeat last week. And so this trip to Asia is, in a way, an opportunity for President Bush to try to regain some of his stature as a world leader. Certainly, Asian leaders will be looking very, very closely for any signs of weakness. And we did, in fact, have such a sign earlier this week when the U.S. Congress failed to pass a bill that would have liberalized trade with Vietnam. That was a bill that President Bush did want to have in hand when he visited East Asia. Of course, the trip to Vietnam itself carries with it a heavy load of historical significance. It's a reminder of a war that ended very, very badly for the United States, even as the country tries to disengage or find a way out of a costly and unpopular quagmire in Iraq. It will be President Bush's first visit to Vietnam. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not go to Vietnam during the 1960s. He served at home in the Texas Air National Guard.
Rob Reynolds in Washington will have to leave it there, and Jonah Hull in Moscow. Thank you both. A UN-commissioned report on Somalia highlights the regional scale of the conflict there. It says that the Union of Islamic Courts is getting weapons and military training from countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia and Eritrea, whereas the transitional government is being supplied with arms by Ethiopia, Uganda and Yemen. The dangers of an all-out regional war are very real. However, as Mohammed Adaw reports, the streets of Mogadishu are the safest they've been in years.
46-year-old Fadumo Adan Osobli has survived the ravages of war in Somalia, but only just. For the past 16 years, Fadumo lived in Mogadishu's Bulahobey district. While her neighbors fled to other countries, Fadumo opted to remain in the chaotic city. It is a decision she dearly paid for.
I had 11 children. I now have only one daughter left. I watched as 2 of my sons were killed by a mortar. The rest of my children died of disease. We did not have any basic services due to the civil war.
But times have changed. The Union of Islamic Courts is now in control of the capital and much of southern Somalia. With constant security patrols and their intolerance to any criminal activity, life for the residents of Mogadishu has become much easier. Critics of the Islamic courts say that all they are interested in is power and ruling the entire country by Sharia law. However, the courts insist they are trying to bring stability to their lawless country.
We're not looking for power. We are trying to create peace and stability in a country where the entire world gave up.
After 16 years of war and death, people like Fadumo want nothing more than a stable, safe life. But with ongoing clashes between the Islamic courts and militia allied to the transitional government, nobody really knows how long this relative calm might last.
Well, let's cross to join Mohammed Adawa now, our correspondent live in Mogadishu. First of all, let me just ask you about this UN commissioned report, which says several nations are pouring weaponry into Somalia. How destabilising is that for the region?
Well, very destabilizing given the fact that Somalia is just emerging, large parts of Somalia are just emerging from civil war and more than 16 years of anarchy. Many people here want peace and stability to come back. And the only hope they had was that the Islamic Courts Union and the government would join together after peace processes and form a government. But up until now, this doesn't seem feasible because the peace process that was supposed to bring both sides together has so far collapsed, and each group is seeking still and sticking to their preconditions that led to the collapse of the talks in Khartoum.
OK, Mohammed, thank you very much for that update.
Well, staying in Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo's president, Joseph Kabila, is set to win a tense runoff election, taking up to 60% of the vote.
But first, Kabila must placate his rival, Jean-Pierre Bemba, a former rebel leader whose fighters have twice clashed with his over election results in the capital, Kinshasa. Al Jazeera's John Cookson is there.
Tensions are rising here again in Kinshasa after the loser in this two-horse race for the Congolese presidency is making allegations of voter fraud. Jean-Pierre Bemba says that victory is being snatched from the Congolese people. Talk like that is highly dangerous in a volatile country where even a minor political dispute can so easily spark violence. This is especially so here in the capital, which is a Bemba stronghold. Last Saturday, 4 people died as rival militias fought running street battles. The city's been calm since then, but the shootout was a sharp reminder of the powder keg that could explode. As a result of a recent upsurge in tensions, the UN and a force of European Union soldiers have been deployed in strategic areas of the capital. Incumbent President Joseph Kabila has 60% of the vote so far, with rival Jean-Pierre Bemba polling just 40%. Meanwhile, American and European diplomats are urging Mr. Bemba to bow out gracefully, accept defeat. That's something he's unlikely to do. That's it from Kinshasa. Back to you.
After years of war and Taliban rule, Afghanistan's economy and infrastructure are in ruins. It's estimated the country needs at least 10 years of continuous aid in order to raise the desperately low standards of education and health.
Indeed, and right now 2/3 of the population are forced to live on less than $2 a day. And for those who do find work, their wages hardly meet the cost of living. James Bays reports from Kabul 5 years after the city fell.
Almost 5 years after the fall of the Taliban, and Afghanistan remains one of the poorest countries on earth. It's hard to believe when you travel around that billions of dollars of reconstruction money have been spent by the West. Yet for most people here, it's a constant struggle to survive. The average income is less than $1 a day. In the city of Mazar-e-Sharif, we visited a family business. 4 brothers work in this blacksmith shop. Their income supports a total of 22 family members.
What about the Taliban? We were hungry then, and we are hungry now. We are 4 partners in the business. Each of us have 4 children. With our income, if we buy meat, we cannot afford potatoes. If we buy potatoes, we cannot afford meat.
In the center of the capital city, Kabul, a small section of the population sees a very different life. A number of glass-fronted office blocks have sprung up as even a shopping mall. But most ordinary Afghans couldn't afford any of the items on sale. The new businesses won't necessarily help the Afghan economy much either, as most of the products have to be imported. A former Minister of Planning has set up an office in a tent in a Kabul park so he can hear the views of the people. The problem, he says, is simple.
There is some international advisor or foreign advisor decide for Afghan people.
He says the West, notably America, is running the show, but they're not listening to ordinary Afghans. Among the people, the anger is growing, with complaints about bureaucracy and widespread corruption, which they say reaches to the highest levels of government.
For many Afghans, this is the reality of life. A mud brick house, an open sewer, no running water, no electricity, and little hope. When you walk the streets and speak to people, many tell you that their lives haven't improved at all in the 5 years since the fall of the Taliban, and they're growing increasingly impatient with the government of Hamid Karzai. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Economic problems in the Americas too. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was recently re-elected for another 4-year term. But many of the country's indigenous population who placed great hopes in his promised land reforms say he hasn't delivered.
Yes, the Guaranis are one of Brazil's largest Amazonian Indian groups, and they have one of the world's highest suicide rates. Al Jazeera's Lucia Newman travelled to southwest Brazil to find out why.
This road carries a warning to truck drivers because it cuts right through a reservation. Not an animal reservation, a reservation for Guarani Indians. Inside, many of the Guaranis say they live worse than animals. The large family that lives here has almost nothing. No beds, furniture, or food. Only bitter mate tea to drink. Making their lives even sadder, the couple's 17-year-old son just committed suicide. He was found hanging from a big tree, like that one, says his father, showing little emotion. A neighbor's son and daughter also hung themselves, just the week before. The boy was 17, the girl just 15, says their father, a sugarcane cutter.
I don't know. I thought they were okay. I went to work, and the next thing I know, I come home, and they're dead.
At least 250 suicides have been reported in the last decade, and the rate is rising. Less than 100 years ago, all the land here in southern Mato Grosso do Sul belonged to the Guaranis. Today, 40,000 Guaranis are crowded onto 8 small reservations, expelled from their tribal lands 50 years ago, with no land to hunt, fish, or plant enough crops to feed themselves. The diet here is almost exclusively starch. The Guaranis grow potatoes, or manioc, or mandioca as it's called here, what the children are eating. And so the malnutrition amongst the youngsters is rampant. That's not all.
Many young men and women are taking their own lives because they don't have anywhere to live, to hunt, to practice our culture, to sing.
Brazil's State Foundation for Indigenous Affairs claims it's trying to give the Guaranis back as much land as possible. How much is that, we ask?
It's what history can do. I mean, can the Celts regain back their lands in England? Can the American Indians regain the whole of the United States? Can the Aztec expel the mestizos and the Spaniards who were in the plateau? No. I mean, it's as much as history will allow.
Well, let's cross straight to Lucia in Rio de Janeiro now. Lucia, from what we saw in your report, it really doesn't sound as though the people you met will ever get the land they want.
Well, surely the Brazilian government is efforting to buy back some of this disputed land and redistribute it to the Guaranis, but it's not nearly enough to accommodate the growing Guarani population. And in addition, the people that are now occupying that land, rich agro producers and cattle farmers, don't want to give it up. It's prime real estate. So while there will be some accommodations, some concessions, it does seem that there's no turning the clock back.
Well, President Lula was re-elected on a record of helping Brazil's poorest people, but it appears that some groups are falling through the net.
Absolutely. He has introduced social programs that have benefited about 40 million people. It's called Bolsa Familia. It basically pays families to send their children to school and to vaccinate them. But this doesn't address the problems of the Guaranis. Their problem is land or lack of it. And in that, the government is not really coming up with the goods.
OK, Lucia, thank you very much for that. Lucia Newman in Rio de Janeiro there.
Let's go back to Gaza. The scenes, the suffering, these are familiar to people across the world as Palestinians endure almost daily Israeli attacks. On the front line every day are the emergency services. For ambulance crews, treating the injured is only part of the job. In this special first-person report, we hear from Palestinian ambulance driver Khalid Abu Saada, who spent nearly 10 years picking up the victims and trying to keep himself alive.
The Israeli army fired a missile at us. I was able to drive my colleagues to safety. But these were the hardest moments of my life. We were all injured. We couldn't help each other. I was expecting them to fire another missile that would tear us apart. My name is Khalid Abu Saadi. I've been an ambulance driver at Al Auda Hospital since it opened in 1997. During the first year, I worked in the hospital as a volunteer. The thing I like most about my job is when they tell me to go and rescue injured people. When I start my car, I depend on God and forget everything else. I only think of how to get to the wounded as fast as possible. We face a lot of difficulties from the Israeli army. Sometimes there is someone who is injured, but the army fires on us, so we can't reach him. It makes my heart ache that we could get to that person, but the army is preventing us. Just today, it took us over an hour to coordinate with the army to get to the young man who was wounded. By the time we reached him, he had bled to death. The hardest scene so far is one I'll never forget. There was an injured woman. Her arm was cut off. I was looking at her and she opened her eyes and closed them. I read in her eyes that she was calling out to me to save her. The scent of blood is very disturbing. After the Israeli incursion into Jabalia, I kept smelling blood for 2 months. I could barely eat for 2 weeks. When people used to ask me if my weight loss was from fear or lack of food, I would say both.
A taste of life as an ambulance driver in Gaza, in the words of Khalid Abu Saada.
Now, China has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It also appears to have some of the fastest drivers too.
Beijing's youth are enjoying life in the fast lane, racing through the streets at speeds of up to 150 kilometers an hour. Tony Cheng tried to keep up with them.
Racing to beat the traffic. And in Beijing, that's not easy. But this young driver isn't just in a hurry to get home. He's an illegal road racer, skipping through the traffic as if it was a video game. It takes him 13 minutes to go around the second ring road. That's an average speed of 150 kilometers per hour in one of the world's busiest cities.
On a racing circuit, it would be faster, but out racing on the road is definitely more exciting.
Every minute of every day, 100 new motor vehicles are hitting China's streets. That's why it's incredible that someone could get around this ring road quite so fast. But despite the congestion and the traffic jams, China seems to have fallen madly in love with the car.
It's not just about greasy overalls and engines. In modern China, the girls want some of the fun too. These models have formed a racing club. They get together once a week. You can control your destiny in a car, says the club founder.
Inside the car, you're completely free. I don't have to think about anything but driving.
Whether it's about personal freedom or just fast kicks, there's no denying the glamour of China's new flamboyant youth. Tony Cheng, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
Well, let's get an update now on our breaking news story. A tsunami warning has been upgraded in Japan after an earthquake measuring at least 8.1 on the Richter scale occurred at sea. These are the latest pictures from Japan's NHK television. The quake was felt at 8:30 a.m. local time, and there are concerns that a tsunami could soon hit the northeastern coast of Japan. In fact, we are just hearing that a small tsunami has in fact hit northern Japan. Now, authorities in northeastern Japan are evacuating 6 cities in the area. Meteorologists say the tsunami's waves after a magnitude earthquake of that magnitude could reach a high of up to 7 meters. We haven't any details yet on how big the tsunami is that has in fact hit. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii said the warning also applied to the Marcus, Wake and Midway Islands. It didn't apply to Alaska and other parts of the US East Coast. Well, we will, of course, keep you fully updated on that breaking news story. I repeat, a small tsunami, we think, has in fact hit northern Japan, and we will give you more on that as we get more.
Indeed. Now do stay with Al Jazeera, because later on this, our launch day, we'll be hearing from Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and Hamas political leader Khalid Mish'al will also be talking to Sudan's Foreign Minister on the crisis in Darfur.
Meanwhile, that's it from the two of us for now. We will be crossing to our Kuala Lumpur News Centre for more news in just a couple of minutes' time, including much more on that breaking story.
Stay with us.
Hello there. Well, let's check what the weather's got in store for us over the next few days. And at the moment, over the Arabian Peninsula, things are mostly fine and dry. A few clouds there, but they've mostly been fizzling out. Over the other side of the Gulf, though, that cloud is thick enough just to give a few spots of rain. Maybe not today, but it looks like Thursday we're going to see a little bit of wet weather there. Elsewhere, perhaps a bit more cloud over Doha, but the bright weather should eventually begin to break through, and temperatures up to quite a pleasant 30 degrees as the humidity is dropping off as we head through November. Now, further north, and we've seen a fair amount of cloud here recently, but that's now beginning to break up, and it looks like Thursday should be a fine day. Some good sunshine coming through here, a glorious day. Temperatures up at around 17 or 18 degrees. Things are very different through Europe, though, very unsettled indeed. Got a lot of very heavy rain working its way through many parts of Britain and Ireland at the moment, then digging its way down through eastern parts of Europe as well, still giving a fair amount of wet weather. For the rest of the day, we can expect that rain to continue through many parts of Britain and Ireland and eventually work its way into Spain and Portugal as well. Looks like the worst of that weather is going to reach us later on Thursday. Some very heavy rain there for Spain, Madrid particularly seeing a very wet day. But further west, we do have some bright weather to be found. Looks like Greece should see a fair amount of sunshine during the day. But as you head up towards Moscow, things turn wet once more and some sleet and snow there.
I have always said that I like to be where the new frontiers are. Right now, Al Jazeera is the new frontier.
The people who have an interesting story to tell that is worth telling.
I'll say what I like, I'm not beholden to anyone. If you don't like it, f*** off.
But I think one thing you can definitely say about Al Jazeera is that it will and does evoke a reaction.
I care more about the truth and getting the truth in my story than I do about controlling the message like I did before when I was a spokesperson.
Documentaries, current affairs and entertainment. Al Jazeera gives you a fresh look on our world.
Al Jazeera is about perspective. The Arabic language channel was about presenting a new perspective. Now we're doing it in English.
Al Jazeera is setting the news agenda on the web. Here, you can see another side of world events. You can hear the other side of the story. This net is alive. aljazeera.net/English.
Witness on Al Jazeera.
A Palestinian rocket kills an elderly woman in Sderot. Israel has promised revenge. Welcome to the World News from Al Jazeera, live from Kuala Lumpur for the very first time. I'm Veronica Pedrosa.
And I'm Taimur Nabili. Also on the programme, residents along Japan's Pacific coast are fleeing their homes. A powerful earthquake has raised fears of a tsunami.
Tensions in the refugee camps of Darfur will cross live to Sudan.
And after years of conflict, a degree of calm is returning to Somalia's capital.
One issue has been dominating politics in the Middle East for decades: the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians.
Wednesday brought yet another casualty. This time the victim was an Israeli, an elderly woman killed by a Palestinian rocket attack on Sderot near the Gaza border. It's the first fatal attack from Gaza on Israel in more than 6 months, despite hundreds of rockets launched. Israel has warned that those responsible will pay a heavy price. Wednesday's death is in sharp contrast to the Israeli raids into Gaza, which have left at least 300 Palestinians dead since June. Israel says the incursions are necessary to stop militant rocket fire.
Military action isn't the only source of suffering for Palestinians. International sanctions have cut off vital aid, leaving millions of Palestinians desperate for food. David Chater looks at life under siege.
The agony of Gaza etched on the faces of its children. Their hold on life now as fragile as the hopes for peace. But Israeli artillery shells are not the only danger stalking the future of a new generation of Palestinians here. In the ruins of a disintegrating economy, it's being called the hidden hunger. The UN's World Food Programme say 85% of Gazans are now dependent on food handouts. In the rubble of their home left by the Israeli army when they ended their occupation of Bet Hanun, these children are not looking for their favorite toys or clothes. It's food that's now their most valuable possession: a carton of olive oil and a sack of flour. After days of humiliation and hunger, their mother weeps in anger and grief. But beneath the surface here, tens of thousands of families are now living a life of quiet desperation, unable to provide their children with the food they need.
1.1 million people in the Gaza Strip are dependent on UN food handouts to survive.
The first cases of malnutrition are beginning to appear in the clinics. Besma is just 6 months old. Her name in English means smile. She's desperately underweight for her age. The lifeline of economic aid to Gaza has been cut since Hamas was elected. In some places, 9 out of every 10 men are now unemployed. Dr. Hamad, a Palestinian academic, visiting his parents in their partially destroyed home in the town, told me the Israelis might have redeployed their troops, but they were continuing their occupation, politically, socially, and economically.
They control the Palestinian, putting them in a big cage, and this cage, a human being between looking at them. We are controlling you, we are the main player, we know the time and the place and how we deal with you, and that's the disaster that Palestinians they have to recognize in this moment.
Besieged on all sides, the Palestinians in Gaza see little hope of their ordeal ending. The rockets will continue to be fired into Israel, and Israeli shells will continue to land in their fields and their homes. David Chater, Al Jazeera, Bet Hanun.
Well, Noor O'Day is also live in Gaza. She joins us now live. Noor, there were hopes that things were going to get better for the residents of Beit Hanun. Those hopes are surely dashed now.
Yes, I mean, Beit Hanun has been declared officially a disaster area after the last Israeli incursion, which left in total over 80 Palestinians dead. Now the residents here are waiting anxiously to see how the threats that Israel has announced in the past few days, in the past few hours, will translate in terms of Israeli action, military action in their town. One eye is on the Israeli military, maybe rolling in their town, and another is on the political talks going on between Hamas and Fatah over the formation of a national unity government that they hope would end the political deadlock, lift the siege imposed on the Palestinian Authority, and alleviate their humanitarian suffering.
Tell us a little more about the talks that are going on. Is there any hope from those?
Well, the talks have been, officials from both sides have been very optimistic, and they've said time and again that they've never gone as far as they have now. They seem to have agreed mostly on who will probably head the next government. They may have an agreement also on the framework under which the government will function. What matters most is how the international community, mainly the quartet, will react to the formation of this government, and if the Arab League in particular will help in beginning to end the siege imposed on the Palestinian Authority since the rise of Hamas.
Nurodeh live in Gaza. Let's go straight over to the other side of the border and Jackie Rowland, who's in Jerusalem. Jackie, the Israeli responses to events like this are generally fairly strong. What's the next step here likely to be?
Tamar, I have to say that Israeli public opinion is hardening against Gaza and hardening against these almost daily Qassam rocket attacks, which are leaving people living in southern towns in a constant state of fear. And of course, as you said today, the first fatalities in a very long time as a result of those attacks. Now, Israeli officials really are reflecting Israeli public opinion when they've warned that they will